Jake had always known that peace was a fragile thing, but he never expected it to shatter on a quiet Sunday morning with a voice that could strip paint off a barn. Excuse me. Excuse me, you farmer man. Yes, you. Jake turned slowly, still chewing on a piece of straw, as the screeching voice cut through the crisp morning air like nails on a chalkboard. Standing at the edge of his property was a woman he recognized, but had never had the displeasure of speaking to directly. Karen, the self-appointed queen of the HOA, dressed in her signature overpriced yoga outfit and massive sunglasses that barely concealed the entitled glare in her eyes. Jake sighed, shifting his weight against the wooden fence post. He'd heard stories about her, the HOA horror tales that made their way through town like folklore, but until now, he had been lucky enough to avoid her personally. "What can I do for you?" he asked, already knowing that whatever came out of her mouth next was going to be absurd. Karen crossed her arms and flipped her perfectly styled blonde bob. "We need to talk about your pond," she said, her voice dripping with the kind of condescension that could only come from someone who believed the world revolved around their opinion. Jake's brow furrowed. "My pond." "Yes, your pond." She gestured dramatically behind him, where his private pond shimmered in the morning light, surrounded by tall grass and a few lazy ducks floating across the water. It was a small but beautiful part of his land, something he had worked hard to maintain and keep as a personal retreat. Karen, however, looked at it like a hungry raccoon eyeing an unattended picnic. "The HOA has decided," she continued, as if she were announcing some royal decree, "that it would be beneficial for the community to have access to this shared water feature." Jake let out a single, incredulous laugh. "Shared?" "Yes," Karen said, smiling like she had just bestowed a great honor upon him. "You see, it's very close to our neighborhood, and many of our residents have expressed interest in using it. Swimming, fishing, perhaps even small paddle boats. Oh, and of course, HOA-approved events. Think of the picturesque gatherings." Jake blinked at her, processing the sheer lunacy of what she was saying. "You do realize that this pond is on my property, right? As in private land." Karen waved a manicured hand dismissively. "Oh, details, details. It's practically right there next to us. It only makes sense for it to be open to the HOA community. And since I'm the president, I've taken it upon myself to negotiate this little arrangement with." Jake tilted his head. "Negotiate?" "Yes," she said sweetly, "which means you agree to let us use the pond whenever we like, and in return, we'll generously allow you to be part of the HOA as an honorary member. No fees, of course, just compliance." Jake stared at her, half expecting cameras to pop out from the bushes and reveal that he was on some hidden prank show. But Karen's smug expression told him she was completely serious. "No." Karen blinked as if the word had never been spoken to her before. "I beg your pardon. I said no," Jake repeated. "This is my land, my pond, and I'm not about to let the HOA or you turn it into a community swimming hole." Karen's lips pressed together in a thin, irritated line. "I understand that you might be feeling possessive, but don't you think you're being a bit selfish? After all, a natural water feature like this should be enjoyed by more than just one person." Jake folded his arms. "You mean you want to enjoy it?" Karen gasped dramatically, placing a hand over her chest, as if he had accused her of high treason. "I am merely thinking of the community." "Aha," Jake muttered. Karen let out a frustrated sigh and pulled a neatly folded paper from her expensive-looking handbag. "I thought you might be difficult, so I came prepared." She thrust the paper at him. "This is an official HOA notice. It states that all bodies of water adjacent to our neighborhood are subject to shared community access under our newly implemented guidelines." Jake took the paper and scanned it. It looked fancy, with legal-sounding language and an official HOA letterhead, but it didn't take a genius to see that it was complete nonsense. "You do realize I don't belong to the HOA, right?" "Well," Karen huffed, "technically no, but we're willing to overlook that, given the circumstances." Jake handed the paper back to her. "Not happening." Karen's expression darkened. "I don't think you understand the position you're in. The HOA always gets its way. It's only a matter of time before you realize that resisting is pointless." Jake smiled, amused by how serious she looked. "Oh, trust me, lady. I can be very stubborn." Karen glared at him before forcing a tight-lipped smile. "Fine, if that's how you want to play it. But don't say I didn't warn you." With that, she spun on her heel and stormed off, her overpriced sneakers crunching against the gravel as she muttered to herself about ungrateful farmers. Jake watched her go, shaking his head. He had a feeling this wasn't the end of it, and he was right. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Jake sat on his porch sipping a well-earned beer. The peace of the evening was interrupted by the unmistakable sound of giggling and splashing. His eyes narrowed. Walking toward the pond, he spotted a group of people, HOA members, lounging on inflatable rafts, coolers floating beside them, acting as if they were on a resort vacation. And right in the center of it all, reclining in a ridiculous, oversized pool float shaped like a golden throne, was Karen, sipping a glass of wine like she owned the place. Jake clenched his jaw. They weren't just making requests anymore. They had escalated straight to trespassing. This was war. Jake stood at the edge of his property, arms crossed, watching the unwelcome invaders float around his pond like they had just booked an all-inclusive vacation. Karen, seated on her obnoxious golden pool float, swirled her wine with an air of smug satisfaction. The other HOA members laughed and chatted, completely oblivious to the fact that they were trespassing on private property. Jake took a deep breath, debating whether he should yell, grab his shotgun, or just start draining the pond out of spite. Instead, he opted for something a little more satisfying. Without a word, he pulled out his phone and dialed the sheriff's office. While waiting for them to pick up, he walked down to the water's edge, hands in his pockets. Karen noticed him and waved, grinning like she had already won. "Jake, I was wondering when you'd come to your senses," she said, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. "Why don't you join us? The water is lovely." Jake stared at her, unimpressed. "You have about 5 minutes before I have you all arrested for trespassing." Karen scoffed dramatically, rolling her eyes. "Oh, don't be such a party pooper. We're just enjoying the natural beauty of this shared resource." "It's not shared," Jake said. "It's mine." "You're trespassing." Karen let out a dramatic sigh, then turned to the other HOA members with a knowing smile. "Oh, Jake, you really need to stop thinking of yourself as some kind of land baron. The HOA has already established new guidelines, and the majority of us agree that the pond should be a community space." Jake narrowed his eyes. "Majority of who?" "You, your husband, a couple of your friends." Karen grinned. "Exactly. A majority vote is a majority vote." Jake let out a dry chuckle. "That's not how private property works." At that moment, the sheriff's truck pulled up, its lights flashing faintly against the darkening sky. Karen's smug expression faltered for a moment, but she quickly regained her composure, flipping her hair and straightening her shoulders as the sheriff stepped out. She put on her best concerned citizen face, as if she was the one calling in a complaint. "Evening, Jake," the sheriff said, nodding toward him before turning to the group of floating trespassers. "Mind telling me what's going on here?" Jake gestured toward the pond. "They're trespassing." Karen immediately cut in, placing a dramatic hand over her heart. "Sheriff, this is all just a huge misunderstanding. We're members of the local HOA, and we've recently voted to incorporate this pond into our community guidelines. We assumed Jake was aware of this, but it seems there's been a bit of confusion." The sheriff, a non-nonsense man who had known Jake for years, gave her a blank stare. "Ma'am, I don't care what your HOA voted on. This is private property. If Jake says you're trespassing, you're trespassing." Karen let out an exaggerated laugh, as if the very idea was absurd. "Oh, come on. This is practically public land. It's a natural body of water. Surely there's some rule that says he can't just hoard it for himself." The sheriff sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "No, ma'am, there is not." Karen's smile twitched. Well, what about water rights? There are laws about public access to water." The sheriff shook his head. "Not when the water is on private land. This pond belongs to Jake." Karen's face twitched again, but she wasn't done yet. She turned back to Jake, crossing her arms. "You're being ridiculous," she snapped. "What harm does it do to share? You don't even use it that much." Jake raised an eyebrow. "So now I have to use my own pond a certain amount before I'm allowed to keep it private?" Karen huffed. "I don't see why you're being so stubborn about this. We're offering you the chance to be part of something bigger, say, a community." Jake smirked. "A community that I never joined, never wanted to join, and was never part of." The sheriff cleared his throat. "All right, folks, this is simple. If you don't leave right now, you're all getting trespassing citations." There was a moment of hesitation as the HOA members exchanged nervous glances. A few started paddling their rafts toward the shore, clearly not willing to risk legal trouble. But Karen, she held her ground, or rather, her float. "You can't be serious," she hissed at the sheriff. This is blatant discrimination. The sheriff raised an eyebrow. How so? Karen floundered for a moment, then pointed a dramatic finger at Jake. Because he's a farmer. And we're part of the HOA. We have rights. The sheriff looked utterly unimpressed. No, ma'am, you don't have the right to trespass. Now, get out of the water. Karen glared at Jake one last time before dramatically flipping off her float and stomping out of the pond, her clothes dripping wet. She marched past Jake, muttering under her breath about power-hungry landowners and injustice. As the last of the trespassers scurried away, the sheriff turned to Jake. Want me to press charges? Jake thought about it for a moment before shaking his head. Not yet, but if they come back, I won't be so nice. The sheriff nodded. I'll make sure they understand that. He gave Karen one last look before heading back to his truck. Karen stood near the road, her wet clothes clinging to her, looking like a drowned cat. But as Jake turned to go back to his porch, she called out, her voice cold. You're making a big mistake, Jake. Jake didn't even turn around. You made one first. Karen huffed, then stormed off into the night. Jake exhaled, finally letting himself relax. He had won this round, but he had a feeling this wasn't the last he'd hear from Karen or the HOA. If there was one thing he knew about entitled people, it was that they didn't know how to take no for an answer. That night, as he sat on his porch watching the moon reflect off his private pond, he made a mental note to install cameras, maybe even a fence. If Karen wanted a war over this pond, she was about to find out just how stubborn a farmer could be. Jake had expected Karen to come back with another ridiculous attempt at claiming his pond, but even he wasn't prepared for how fast she escalated things. It started the very next morning when he found an envelope taped to his gate. The paper inside had the same fancy HOA letterhead from before, but this time, it wasn't just a request, it was a demand. According to the document, the HOA had officially revised its rules to include any natural bodies of water within a certain proximity to the neighborhood as shared community resources. In bold letters, it stated that Jake was required to remove any and all barriers preventing HOA members from reasonable access to the water. Jake laughed out loud, standing at his gate, shaking his head in disbelief. It was almost impressive how delusional Karen was. Almost. He walked back to his house, crumpling the paper in his fist, and tossed it straight into the trash. There was no law in existence that gave an HOA the right to claim someone else's property just because they wanted to. Still, he knew this wasn't the last he'd hear of it. Karen was persistent, and if she had already jumped to fake legal documents, she was just getting started. The next few days were eerily quiet. Too quiet. Jake half expected Karen to show up screaming at his door again, but she didn't. Instead, things got weirder. One afternoon, as he was hauling some feed out to his chickens, he noticed a few unfamiliar people standing near the pond, pointing and taking notes on clipboards. He marched over, ready to kick them off his property, when a tall, thin man in an ill-fitting suit turned to him with a fake professional smile. Mr. Lawson, I presume, the man said. Jake frowned. Who's asking? The man extended a hand, which Jake didn't take. I'm Daniel Griffith, a representative from the HOA Planning Committee. We're conducting a routine survey regarding potential community expansions, and your pond has come up as a point of interest. Jake crossed his arms, resisting the urge to laugh in the guy's face. Community expansion? You do realize this is private land, right? Griffith nodded like he hadn't heard a word Jake just said. We understand that currently, the pond is under your care. However, given its location and the potential benefits to the HOA community, we are exploring options for integration into our recreational development plan. Jake shook his head, biting back his frustration. You can explore all you want, but you're not taking my pond. The man clicked his pen and made a note on his clipboard. We appreciate your input. We'll be in touch. Jake didn't even get the chance to respond before the group of so-called surveyors turned and walked away, whispering amongst themselves as if they were already planning out where to put the picnic tables and boat dock. That night, Jake installed motion-activated cameras around the pond. He had a bad feeling about where this was heading, and if Karen was really going to keep pushing, he wanted proof of whatever stunt she pulled next. It didn't take long for that proof to come rolling in. The very next morning, his phone buzzed with an alert from the cameras. He opened the app and watched in disbelief as the footage played. In the dead of night, Karen and a group of HOA members had snuck onto his land, armed with buckets of paint and wooden stakes. They were hammering signs into the ground, official-looking signs that declared the pond as HOA community property and open to all residents per HOA regulations. Karen, dressed in some ridiculous outdoor expedition outfit, was barking orders while a few of her lackeys splattered bright blue paint along the fence posts, marking the area like they were reclaiming stolen land. Jake wasted no time. He called the sheriff again and forwarded the footage, all while shaking his head in disbelief. These people had lost their minds. An hour later, the sheriff arrived, this time bringing a deputy along with him. By the time Jake walked out to meet them, Karen was already there, standing near the pond with her arms crossed, acting as if she had every right to be there. "Morning, Jake," the sheriff said, rubbing his temples like he was already exhausted. "Looks like we've got another dispute." Jake gestured to the freshly planted signs. "Dispute? More like criminal trespassing and vandalism." Karen scoffed. "Oh, please. If anything, he's the one who should be in trouble. He's been hoarding a community resource. The HOA has already voted to incorporate this area into our official neighborhood amenities." The sheriff turned to her, deadpan. "Ma'am, you can't vote to take someone else's property." Karen's eyes widened in theatrical disbelief. "Oh, really? Well, I suppose we'll just have to let the lawyers decide that." Jake let out a breath of amusement. "You really think you have a case here?" Karen smirked. "Of course. We've already had several meetings about this, and I have signatures from community members supporting the pond's inclusion. And legally speaking, there are cases where public access rights override." The sheriff held up a hand, cutting her off. "None of that applies here. This is private land, privately owned, and you and your little committee just committed trespassing, vandalism, and property damage." Karen's smug expression faltered, but only for a second. "Oh, don't be ridiculous," she snapped. "We were simply making it clear that the pond belongs to everyone." The sheriff exhaled, clearly running out of patience. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to remove these signs immediately. And you and your HOA need to stay off Jake's land unless you want to spend the night in a jail cell." Karen clenched her jaw, clearly struggling to keep her composure. "Fine," she said through gritted teeth. "But this isn't over." Jake smirked. "Oh, I know." As Karen and her group reluctantly removed their fake signs, Jake made another decision. He was done playing defense. If the HOA wanted to keep pushing, then he was going to push back harder. That night, he had his lawyer draft an official trespassing complaint and a cease and desist letter specifically targeting the HOA's fraudulent claims over his pond. He also included a bill for the damage they had done, along with a warning that if they stepped onto his land again, they'd be dealing with more than just citations. The next morning, he sent everything straight to Karen's mailbox. He didn't even have to wait long for the fireworks. By the afternoon, Karen was back at his gate, waving the letter in the air, her face red with fury. "You think you can threaten me?" she screeched. "Do you even know who you're dealing with?" Jake leaned against the fence post, calm as ever. "Yeah, a woman who doesn't understand the word note." Karen's nostrils flared. "You just made a huge mistake." Jake chuckled. "Funny, I was just about to say the same thing to you." Karen turned on her heel and stormed off, muttering something about lawyers and court dates. Jake watched her go, unfazed. She thought she was winning this battle, but what she didn't realize was that he had just set the perfect trap. Let her take it to court. He had all the evidence he needed, and when this was over, she wouldn't just lose, she'd be humiliated. The war over the pond wasn't ending anytime soon, but Jake had a feeling it was about to get a lot more interesting. Jake had seen a lot of ridiculous things in his life, but what Karen did next took entitlement to a whole new level. Less than 48 hours after he sent the cease and desist letter, the HOA responded in the most absurd way possible. He woke up to the sound of car doors slamming outside his property. When he looked out his window, he saw a small group of HOA members gathering at the entrance of his driveway, clutching signs and clipboards like they were about to protest some great injustice. Jake grabbed his coffee, walked onto his porch, and leaned against the railing as Karen stepped forward, holding a megaphone like she was leading a political rally. She took a deep breath, raised the device to her mouth, and in her shrillest voice yet, declared that Jake was officially under HOA violation notice. He stared at her, taking a slow sip of his coffee before speaking. "You do realize I'm not part of the HOA, right?" Karen lowered the megaphone just enough to glare at him. "That is exactly the problem, Jake. Your refusal to cooperate with community guidelines has left us with no choice but to take legal action." Jake squinted at her. "Legal action? For what?" Karen lifted a stack of papers and flipped dramatically through them. "First, for failure to comply with newly established neighborhood water access guidelines. Second, for obstruction of public enjoyment by installing unauthorized security devices around a shared natural resource. And third, for Jake cut her off, shaking his head. I'm going to stop you right there. You people are insane. Karen gasped, looking personally offended. We are not insane, Jake. We are trying to create a harmonious living environment where everyone benefits. But instead, you've chosen to be selfish, aggressive, and completely unreasonable. Jake laughed. Karen, you broke into my property, vandalized my land, and now you're trying to fine me for not letting you steal my pond. Karen rolled her eyes. It's not stealing. It's reallocation. Jake took another slow sip of his coffee, letting the words sink in. Reallocation? He repeated. Yes, Karen said, lifting her chin like she had just made a brilliant point. The same way public parks, beaches, and other community resources are shared among residents. You have more than enough land to yourself. It's only fair that you contribute to the greater good. Jake exhaled through his nose, setting his coffee cup down on the porch railing. All right, let's assume for a second that any of this nonsense made sense. Let's pretend for a moment that you actually have any legal ground to stand on here. What exactly do you plan on doing if I refuse? Karen smirked, flipping to another page of her stack of nonsense. If you refuse to comply, the HOA will be forced to take you to court, where we will present a case for mandatory community access. Jake stared at her, deadpan. You want to sue me over a pond? Karen's smirk widened. Not just a pond. A valuable community resource that you are illegally restricting access to. Jake let out a low chuckle. Karen, I have security footage of you and your friends trespassing and vandalizing my property. If you take me to court, you're going to end up in a lot more trouble than me. Karen waved a hand dismissively. Oh, please. A few harmless visits don't outweigh the needs of the many. Jake shook his head in disbelief. You really think you're going to win this, don't you? Karen's confidence was almost comical. She placed a hand on her hip and grinned. Jake, I always win. For a moment, he considered arguing further, but he realized something. He didn't have to. Karen was digging her own grave, and she didn't even know it yet. Instead of engaging, he simply smiled. All right, Karen, take me to court. Her eyes widened slightly, as if she hadn't expected him to call her bluff. Fine, she huffed. I will. She spun on her heel, marching back to the group of HOA members. They all clapped politely, as if she had just won a great victory. Jake watched as they shuffled back into their SUVs and minivans, already imagining how this was going to blow up in her face. Later that evening, Jake made sure his lawyer had all the footage, all the ridiculous letters, and every single fabricated violation notice Karen had tried to push on him. He didn't need to fight this battle with anger or frustration. He just needed to let the legal system do its job. A few days passed, and Jake noticed something strange. The HOA, which had always been full of smug, overly confident residents, seemed oddly quiet. No more fake violation notices, no more late-night trespassing, no Karen screeching at his gate. At first, he thought they were just gearing up for their court case. But then he overheard something interesting at the local hardware store. Apparently, Karen's lawsuit wasn't going over so well with the rest of the HOA members. Many of them hadn't even known about it until she started boasting about how she was going to set a precedent for HOA community expansion rights. Some residents, especially those already unhappy with her ridiculous rules and increasing fees, were now questioning her leadership. Jake smirked as he loaded up his supplies, wondering just how far Karen had pushed her luck. By the time the official court date was announced, it was clear that the HOA was in damage control mode. Several members who had once supported Karen were now trying to distance themselves from her. The lawsuit had put a huge financial strain on the HOA, and people were starting to ask questions about whether this was really worth the cost. Karen, however, refused to back down. In her mind, this was her great battle, and she was convinced she was going to win. She showed up to court in a pristine white pantsuit, sunglasses perched on top of her head, acting like she was about to make history. Jake, on the other hand, walked in relaxed, dressed in jeans and a button-down shirt, completely unbothered. He had seen every piece of evidence his lawyer had prepared, and he knew exactly how this was going to go. As the judge took his seat, Karen shot him a smirk as if she had already won. Jake just smiled back. This was going to be fun. Jake sat in the courtroom, watching as Karen fidgeted with her stack of neatly organized papers, a smug expression plastered across her face. She had strutted into the courthouse as if she owned the place, flashing self-satisfied smiles at the HOA members who had come to witness her so-called victory. Her confidence was almost impressive, considering she was about to get utterly humiliated. Jake, on the other hand, was as relaxed as ever, hands resting on the table in front of him, his lawyer beside him flipping through their own set of documents, the real legal ones. The judge, an older man who looked like he had no patience for nonsense, took his seat and cleared his throat. All right, let's get to it. The HOA versus Mr. Lawson regarding property rights and access. Miss Daniels, you are representing the HOA. Karen stood up dramatically, smoothing out her suit like she was preparing to make the speech of a lifetime. That is correct, Your Honor. I am here today representing not just the HOA, but the entire community that has suffered due to Mr. Lawson's refusal to share what is rightfully a community resource. The judge raised an eyebrow. Rightfully? Yes, Karen said, nodding as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. We have reviewed our community guidelines and determined that his pond falls under shared recreational space. The HOA has already voted on this matter, and it has been agreed upon by a majority that the pond should be accessible to all members of our neighborhood. Jake's lawyer leaned forward. Your Honor, the HOA does not own the pond. It is on private property, which has been owned and maintained by my client, Mr. Lawson, for years. The HOA has no jurisdiction over it. Karen scoffed, flipping through her stack of papers before dramatically holding one up. Your Honor, if I may direct your attention to Exhibit A, our revised community guidelines. The judge took the paper, skimming it for a moment before looking back at her, clearly unimpressed. Miss Daniels, you cannot vote to take ownership of someone else's property. That is not how property law works. Karen's smug smile twitched slightly, but she quickly recovered. But Your Honor, this isn't just his property. It is a natural body of water, which, by definition, should be a shared community feature. There are legal precedents for public access to water features that have been used for years by multiple residents. The judge sighed. Is there any evidence that this pond has ever been open to the public before this dispute? Karen hesitated for a fraction of a second before lifting her chin. That is irrelevant. The point is, it is very relevant. The judge interrupted, his voice sharp. You are arguing that this pond has historically been a shared resource, and yet you have provided no evidence that it has ever been used by anyone other than Mr. Lawson. Karen's face turned red, but she pushed forward. Well, that's because Mr. Lawson has been hoarding it all for himself. We only recently became aware of the potential it had for our community. Jake smirked, leaning back in his chair. So you just decided that you wanted it, and now you think it belongs to you? Karen spun toward him, her eyes flashing. It's not about what I want. It's about what's fair. Jake's lawyer chuckled. Your Honor, if I may. He slid a folder across the table toward the judge. Here is evidence that the HOA, under Miss Daniels' leadership, has repeatedly trespassed on my client's property, vandalized his land, and even went as far as posting fraudulent signage claiming ownership. We have multiple instances of security footage, photographs, and even eyewitness testimony from HOA members who disagreed with Miss Daniels' actions. Karen's mouth fell open as the judge flipped through the folder, his expression growing darker with each page. Jake's lawyer continued. Additionally, here is a copy of the official property deed, clearly stating that the pond is, and always has been, private property. Mr. Lawson has never agreed to any shared access and has made repeated efforts to keep the HOA from unlawfully using his land. The judge turned to Karen, his patience wearing thin. Miss Daniels, do you have any actual legal documents proving that the HOA has a claim to this pond? Karen opened and closed her mouth, then shuffled through her papers frantically, as if she could somehow will a real legal document into existence. We have a signed petition, she finally blurted. The judge stared at her. A petition? Yes, Karen said, gripping onto the last straw she had. Over 50 residents signed, agreeing that the pond should be shared. That has to count for something. Jake's lawyer sighed. Your Honor, signing a petition does not override property law. The judge looked over at Karen, his expression now completely unamused. Miss Daniels, not only does the HOA have no claim to this property, but your actions, including trespassing, vandalism, and attempting to intimidate Mr. Lawson into compliance, border on harassment. Frankly, I am appalled by the lengths you have gone to in order to steal land that does not belong to you. Karen's face drained of color. Steal? She repeated, as if the word offended her. Yes, the judge said firmly. And given the evidence presented, I am ruling completely in favor of Mr. Lawson. The HOA has zero claim to this pond, and any further attempts to interfere with his property will result in legal consequences. Jake smirked as Karen's jaw clenched so tightly he thought she might crack a tooth. But then the judge continued. Furthermore, due to the repeated trespassing and property damage, I am issuing a formal restraining order against Miss Daniels. She is prohibited from coming within 500 feet of Mr. Lawson's pond. Karen's eyes widened in horror. What? You can't do that. I absolutely can, the judge said. And if the HOA continues any attempts to harass Mr. Lawson, further legal action will be taken. Jake could barely contain his laughter as Karen fumed, her fists clenched at her sides. She had walked into this courtroom acting like she had already won, and now she was leaving with not just a total loss, but a restraining order to go with it. As the judge banged his gavel and declared the case closed, Karen turned to Jake, her face twisted with rage. You think you're so smart, don't you? She hissed. Jake grinned. No, I just think you're really bad at stealing things. Karen let out an enraged scream before storming out of the courtroom, her heels clicking violently against the floor. The remaining HOA members shuffled awkwardly, trying to pretend they hadn't been part of this disaster. Jake stood up, shaking his lawyer's hand. That went even better than I expected. His lawyer chuckled. Oh, it's not over yet. You still have the option to sue for damages. Jake smirked as he watched Karen stomp out of the building. Maybe I will, he mused, just to make sure she really learns her lesson. Outside, as he stepped into the fresh air, he let out a deep, satisfied breath. The battle over the pond was finally over, and the best part? He had won. Jake had always believed in handling problems the old-fashioned way, face-to-face, with a firm handshake and a fair resolution. But dealing with Karen and her HOA had been like trying to reason with a toddler who thought throwing a tantrum would get them a free toy. He had expected the fight over the pond to be ridiculous, but even he hadn't anticipated just how far Karen would push her entitlement. Now, with the court ruling in his favor and a restraining order keeping Karen off his land, he should have been able to sit back and enjoy the victory. But there was one final piece of justice he wasn't quite ready to let go of yet. The morning after the court case, he sat on his porch with his coffee, watching as a few HOA members cautiously walked past his property, avoiding eye contact like children who had been caught stealing. News of Karen's legal humiliation had spread fast, and it was clear that many people were now questioning whether they had backed the right person. Jake had overheard some talk at the local store that night. Some HOA members were furious that Karen had dragged them into an expensive lawsuit that they had never agreed to. The court costs, the lawyer fees, and the absolute embarrassment of losing so publicly had made her position as HOA president a whole lot shakier. That was when Jake got an idea. He grabbed his phone, called his lawyer, and asked a simple question. What would it take to make the HOA pay for the damage they had done to my property? His lawyer chuckled before replying that they had more than enough grounds for a lawsuit, considering the multiple instances of trespassing, vandalism, and Karen's outright fraudulent attempt to seize his pond. He had the footage, the documentation, and the court ruling as proof. It was an airtight case. Jake wasn't usually a petty man, but after everything Karen had put him through, he figured she deserved one last dose of karma. So, he told his lawyer to go ahead and file the claim. It wasn't about the money, though the damage had cost him quite a bit. It was about making sure Karen and her HOA knew that he wasn't just going to roll over. A few days later, the HOA held an emergency meeting. Jake wasn't invited, of course, but he didn't need to be there to know what was going down. The lawsuit had sent the entire organization into full-blown panic mode. Karen, as usual, tried to spin the situation, claiming that Jake was just being vindictive and that they should all stand together against him. But for the first time, people weren't buying it. It turned out that many of the HOA members hadn't actually supported Karen's ridiculous war over the pond. They had just gone along with it because they assumed she knew what she was doing. Now, with the HOA facing a lawsuit and on the verge of financial ruin thanks to the legal fees she had racked up, they weren't just questioning her leadership, they were actively turning against her. A week later, Jake was out fixing his fence when he heard the commotion. Karen was standing in the middle of the HOA meeting area, screaming at a group of residents who were trying to vote her out. She was shouting about how ungrateful they all were, how she had fought for them, how she had tried to create a better community, and how they were betraying her. It was a full-blown meltdown. Jake leaned against the fence post and watched from a distance, sipping a lemonade, as the vote was cast. By the end of the meeting, Karen had officially been removed as HOA president. The news spread fast, and by the next morning, Karen had gone from the smug ruler of the neighborhood to an outcast. No one wanted anything to do with her. The same people who had once applauded her aggressive rule now avoided her entirely. Jake couldn't help but enjoy the irony of it all. She had spent so much time trying to force her way onto his property, but now she wasn't even welcome in her own neighborhood. Then came the final blow. The HOA, desperate to recover from the financial hole Karen had put them in, was forced to raise the neighborhood fees. Residents were furious. Some of them even started talking about leaving the HOA entirely. And Karen? Well, she had a bigger problem. Without her power in the HOA, she had no control over the budget. And since she had spent so much of her time focusing on his pond instead of handling the actual responsibilities of an HOA president, she had completely neglected her own finances. Rumor had it that she was struggling to keep up with her mortgage payments, especially now that the lawsuit had put extra pressure on her finances. Jake didn't take joy in people struggling, but he couldn't help but find it poetic that after all her efforts to take something from him, she was the one who was now at risk of losing everything. A few weeks later, Jake was hauling supplies into his truck when he noticed a moving van parked outside Karen's house. He watched as she stood on the front lawn, yelling at the movers, clearly trying to maintain some illusion of control. But the truth was obvious. She had lost. She caught sight of him and glared, her face twisted in anger. He just gave her a small, satisfied nod before heading back into his house. He didn't need to say anything. They both knew how this had ended. A few months later, peace had finally returned to Jake's land. No more trespassers, no more fake HOA notices. The pond was as quiet and untouched as it had always been, just the way he liked it. Occasionally, he'd get a visitor, one of the old HOA members who had turned against Karen, stopping by to apologize or to quietly admit that they never wanted to be part of the ridiculous fight in the first place. Jake didn't hold any grudges. People got swept up in nonsense sometimes. The important thing was that they had learned their lesson. And if they hadn't, well, that was their problem. One afternoon, as Jake was sitting on his porch watching the ducks float lazily across the pond, his neighbor Tom walked up the driveway. "Looks like things finally settled down, huh?" Tom said, leaning against the railing. Jake smirked. "Took long enough." Tom chuckled. "You hear about Karen?" Jake raised an eyebrow. "What about her?" "She moved across town. Got herself a tiny condo in one of those strict HOA neighborhoods. Word is, she's already fighting with the board over some nonsense." Jake shook his head, letting out a low laugh. "Some people never learn." Tom grinned. "Guess not." The two of them sat there for a while, enjoying the quiet. The pond shimmered in the afternoon light, peaceful as ever. The battle had been long, ridiculous, and filled with more drama than Jake had ever wanted in his life. But in the end, justice had been served. The land was his, just as it had always been. And as for Karen, well, she had finally gotten what was coming to her.